Right. Ready to dive into something that's, well, surprisingly close to home. We're talking water. And I know what you're thinking. We all know clean water is important. But did you know that almost a third of the world doesn't have reliable access to it? It's like, I don't know, if you had to choose between paying for streaming services and having clean water.
Wow.
It's kind of a head scratcher.
Sure.
Especially since, like, was it COP26? All those world leaders were saying we need to pump up the spending on water infrastructure. So, like, where's the disconnect?
Right.
You sent over this really interesting World Bank report, Funding a Water-Secure Future. So today we're going on a deep dive to figure that out. Like, where does the money go? Who benefits? And what are those, like, hidden factors that are shaping this whole water crisis?
It's kind of a paradox, right? We all need water, like, every single day for everything, but we're not really treating it with, I don't know, the urgency it deserves. And this report gives us a really, really detailed look at exactly how we're spending on water infrastructure globally, and more importantly, where we're falling short.
So let's follow the money. First things first, who's paying for all this water infrastructure?
Well, the bulk of it, around 85.5%, comes from governments.
Okay.
But, and here's where it gets interesting, that sounds like a lot.
Right.
But it's actually a tiny fraction of their overall spending.
Okay, so governments are kind of like pinching pennies when it comes to water. How bad is it, really?
It's pretty eye-opening. So the report looked at 68 countries, and get this, on average, they only dedicated about 1.2% of their budgets to water infrastructure.
1.2%. That's less than what I spend on coffee. What are they prioritizing instead?
To put it in perspective, things like healthcare and education, those receive over 60% of government spending. Even things like transportation and energy get a much bigger slice of the pie.
It's like, you know your house needs a new roof, but you're like, I'm going to get that home theater system instead. And, you know, speaking of history repeating itself, this reminds me of what you said about that case study in the report about New York City back in 1865. That was a pretty stark example of what happens when we don't prioritize water, right?
Oh, absolutely. So back then they were dealing with this cholera outbreak. And this doctor, Stephen Smith, he formed this board of health, and he realized that the city's water infrastructure was basically a breeding ground for disease. You had sewage seeping into the drinking water.
A recipe for disaster.
It was. But here's the thing. Smith's whole push for a modern sewer system, it wasn't just about public health, it was about equity too. Because he saw firsthand how poor sanitation was disproportionately affecting the city's most vulnerable. And this really underscores a point that this report highlights again and again. These infrastructure decisions, they have this ripple effect, impacting access and equity for generations.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just building, like, pipes and treatment plants. We're shaping the health and well-being of entire communities. But getting back to the money trail, what about international aid? Because I know a lot of low-income countries, they rely on that to kind of bridge the gap, right?
Yeah, you're right. Official Development Assistance, or ODA, it plays a really critical role. It's actually the second largest source of funding for water infrastructure globally. And between 2011 and 2019, an average of $11.7 billion in ODA flowed into the sector every year.
Okay, so we've got governments maybe not doing enough, and then we've got international aid. But is it enough? Like, does all this money actually add up to what we need to solve this global water crisis?
That is the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, the answer is a resounding no. And that's where this whole idea of a spending gap comes into play.
Okay, a spending gap. So paint me a picture. What does that look like in the real world?
Okay, think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to bake a cake, but you only have half the ingredients the recipe calls for.
Okay.
You might end up with something that vaguely resembles a cake. But it's not going to be pretty, and it's certainly not going to be enough for everyone who wants a slice.
And it's probably not going to taste that great.
Exactly. And that's what's happening with the water crisis. This spending gap is the difference between what we're currently spending on water infrastructure and what we actually need to be spending to make sure everyone has access to safe, reliable water.
So why is this gap so big? What's causing it?
Well, part of the problem is just knowing how much money is actually being spent. A lot of countries, especially those facing conflict or economic hardship, they struggle to track and report their water-related expenditures accurately. So it's like trying to bake that cake, but you don't even know how much flour you're missing.
Yeah, we don't even have a complete picture of the problem.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, current spending often ignores hidden costs. Things like, the increasing expense of adapting to climate change. So we're essentially paying to fix problems that are only getting worse because we didn't invest enough up front.
It's a vicious cycle. And this actually reminds me of something I read about groundwater depletion in South Asia. It's a perfect example of those hidden costs coming back to bite us. So countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they rely heavily on groundwater for irrigation. And to boost agricultural production, they've been investing a lot in expanding their irrigation systems. But often, they're doing it without really considering the environmental consequences.
And what they're finding is they're depleting their groundwater resources faster than they can replenish them.
Exactly. So it's like spending all your savings today without thinking about how you're going to pay the bills tomorrow. And so now they're facing water scarcity, land subsidence, this whole host of problems because they didn't account for those long-term costs.
Yeah. It's a classic example of how short-sighted solutions can actually create even bigger problems down the line. And this ties directly back to the human cost of this spending gap.
Because this isn't just about, numbers on a spreadsheet, right? We're talking about real people's lives.
Absolutely. When we don't invest adequately in water infrastructure, the consequences are incredibly real. We see increased food insecurity, higher risk of child malnutrition, a rise in preventable diseases.
And those are just a few examples, right? This issue, it's deeply intertwined with those UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely. SDG 6 in particular, that focuses specifically on ensuring access to clean water and sanitation for everyone by 2030. But as this report very clearly shows, we are a long way off from achieving that goal unless we significantly increase spending and start spending it more effectively.
Okay, so we've established we're not spending enough. And the consequences, they're serious. But this report, it doesn't just talk about how much money, right? It also digs into how that money is being used.
You're exactly right. And that's one of the most insightful parts of this report. It's not just about throwing more money at the problem. It's about spending smarter.
So less about overflowing budgets and more about fixing those leaky faucets. Tell me more.
Exactly. One of the key metrics the report uses is this thing called the budget execution rate. It basically tells us how much of the money that's allocated for water infrastructure actually gets spent. And what they found is actually pretty concerning.
Okay, I'm hooked. Give me the numbers. What are we looking at?
On average, the water sector has a budget execution rate of just 72%.
Wow.
Which means that more than a quarter of the funds that are intended for these crucial water projects aren't even being used.
Wow. 72%. That's a significant chunk of money not reaching its target. What's causing this disconnect? Is it just bad planning? Or is there something more to it?
It's definitely complex, but the report highlights a few factors. One major challenge is this thing called absorptive capacity, which basically means that some countries, especially those with weaker governance structures, they just don't have the systems and the expertise in place to effectively manage and implement these big infrastructure projects. It's like having a brand new high-tech oven, but you don't actually know how to use it.
So even if the money is there, it's not necessarily translating into real progress on the ground.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, this low execution rate that we see in the water sector, it really stands in stark contrast to what we see in other sectors. So, for example, the human development and the transportation sectors, those have execution rates of 99% and 91% respectively.
Okay, so clearly there's something going on here that's specific to the water sector. Are there real-world examples where we see this playing out?
Definitely. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, you see a huge variation in budget execution rates, even within the same region. So Gambia has an average rate of about 136%, which means they're actually exceeding their budget, which is interesting in itself.
Wait, exceeding the budget. How does that even happen? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It can be a bit of both. In some cases, it might indicate that they're using the funds very efficiently, maybe even securing additional funding sources. But it could also be a red flag, right? Suggesting maybe there's some overspending going on or that their initial budget estimations weren't accurate.
So sometimes a high number isn't necessarily good news. What about the other end of the spectrum?
Well, in contrast, you have a country like Togo with an incredibly low execution rate, only 12.5%. And that suggests that there are some serious bottlenecks in their project implementation processes.
It really highlights how those country-specific factors really come into play.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, are there any common threads, any patterns that link these budget execution rates to broader governance issues? Because this whole thing with sub-Saharan Africa makes me wonder if there's something bigger going on.
You're right to think that. The report found a strong correlation between budget execution rates and factors like government effectiveness, regulatory quality, even the perceived legitimacy of the state.
So countries with more transparent and accountable governments tend to spend their water budgets more effectively. Makes sense if you think about it.
Exactly. Strong governance mechanisms, things like clear procurement processes, financial accountability, those are crucial for making sure that money is actually being used for its intended purpose and that projects are being completed on time and within budget.
So we need to look beyond just the dollar amounts, right? It's also about the systems and the structures in place to manage those funds. But what about the groups that are actually delivering these water services? Who are the key players on the ground?
That's another layer of this whole complex puzzle. And the report really dives into the weeds on this, particularly when it comes to state-owned enterprises, or SOEs.
SOEs, yes. They always seem to be a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes they're efficient and effective, and other times not so much. What does the report say about them?
It highlights this dual nature of SOEs. On the one hand, they have the potential to drive economic growth and achieve really important social goals. They can take on projects that the private sector might consider too risky or unprofitable, especially in underserved areas.
So they can be a real force for good, especially when it comes to promoting equitable access to water.
Exactly. But on the other hand, SOEs can also be plagued by inefficiencies. They might be vulnerable to political interference, or they might not have the same profit-driven incentives as private companies. Or they might struggle with outdated infrastructure and management practices.
So they can also be a drag on the system. It's like that old saying, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
It's very fitting given the topic at hand. But I think the key takeaway here, and this is really important, is that SOEs, they're not inherently good or bad. It all comes down to how they're managed and the regulatory environment they operate in.
So how do we measure their performance effectively? Like, if we only focus on pure efficiency, are we missing part of the picture?
You've hit on a really critical point. The report argues that we need more nuanced performance metrics for SOEs. We can't just look at the bottom line. We need to consider their broader social and developmental impact as well.
So it's about finding that balance between efficiency and equity.
Precisely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
This deep dive is full of surprises. But before we move on to the report's recommendations, what stands out to you most from what we've discussed so far? What's really caught your attention?
It's interesting, actually. This report, it kind of challenges some of those common assumptions about, like, the role of the private sector in all of this.
Oh, really? Because I always thought private investment, that was supposed to be like the magic solution, right?
Yeah.
Bringing in the big bucks to fix these problems.
That's often the narrative, but the reality is, well, it's a bit more complicated. So according to the report, private sector involvement in water infrastructure, it's actually surprisingly low. We're talking a mere 3% of global investments in water supply and sanitation between 2009 and 2020.
3%. Wow. That's a drop in the bucket compared to what I was expecting. What's holding private investors back from something as like essential as water? Seems like a no-brainer.
Right. You would think so. But there are a few key reasons. One major factor is just the regulatory landscape surrounding water. In a lot of countries, water resources, they're viewed as a public good, meaning that access should be affordable for everyone.
Right.
So tariffs, which are the prices charged for water services, they're often kept artificially low, which can make it really tough for private companies to see a decent return on their investment.
That makes sense. Businesses are in the business of making money.
Right.
If they don't see that clear path to profitability, they're not going to, jump in.
Yeah.
But surely there are ways to incentivize them. What does the report suggest?
It's not all doom and gloom, is it?
You're right. It's not all bad news. The report, it lays out a pretty, I think, solid roadmap for how we can bridge this spending gap and create a more water-secure future.
Okay.
And it's a multi-pronged approach.
Okay. I'm all ears. Give me the breakdown. What's step one on this roadmap?
So the most immediate priority is really to optimize how we're already spending public funds.
We need to boost those budget execution rates, cut out inefficiencies, and make sure that every single dollar that's earmarked for water infrastructure is being used effectively.
So going back to those leaky faucets, we got to make sure that money's not just disappearing down the drain.
Exactly. We need to address any bureaucratic hurdles, build up that institutional capacity, and really focus on improving how water projects are managed on the ground.
So working smarter, not just harder, with the resources we already have.
Yeah.
But obviously, optimizing that existing spending, that's not going to be enough. We need to find ways to bring more money to the table. Where do we find that extra funding?
That's the next big challenge, right? And the report really emphasizes this need to attract additional resources, both domestically and from the international community.
Okay, so how do we do that? Like, pass the hat around and hope for the best.
Yeah.
What are some, like, concrete steps we can take?
I wish it were that easy. One key strategy the report highlights is to really rethink and reform the regulatory environment surrounding water. We need to make it more enticing for private investors to get involved.
So finding that sweet spot, that balance where private companies can see a fair return on their investment, but it doesn't come at the expense of people's ability to actually access this essential resource.
Exactly. And a big part of that is establishing independent regulatory bodies. So they would be responsible for setting tariffs, but doing it based on sound economic principles rather than, political pressure.
Right. Investors need that predictability. They need to know that the rules of the game aren't going to change overnight because of some political maneuvering.
Right. And one point the report really emphasizes is that having that stable, reliable regulatory environment, that is crucial regardless of whether the service providers are public, private, or some kind of mix of both.
So it's about creating a system that promotes both efficiency and accountability, regardless of who's actually delivering the water. But what about those innovative financing mechanisms that the report mentioned? What role do they play in all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. To attract that long-term financing, we really need to start thinking outside the box.
Okay.
One idea is exploring these risk pooling arrangements, where smaller utilities, they can actually join forces to access capital markets.
So it's kind of like a water infrastructure co-op. Strength in numbers. I like it.
Precisely, because it reduces the risk for investors, which makes these projects more financially viable. The report also suggests, establishing these dedicated financial institutions with a laser focus on funneling long-term investments into water infrastructure.
It sounds like we need a multifaceted approach, pulling in expertise and resources from all different sectors. It's a big task, but if we could pull this off, what would it mean? What's the ultimate message that this report wants us to remember? What's the big takeaway?
If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this whole deep dive, it's this. Solving the global water crisis, it's not simply about throwing more money at the problem. It's about fundamentally changing how we value water. We need to start treating it as a precious asset, one that requires really careful stewardship and investment for the long haul.
I love that framing. Water as an asset.
Yeah.
It really does change the conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about pipes and pumps. It's about recognizing the true value of this finite resource.
Exactly. And it highlights this need for a more holistic perspective, one that transcends national borders and recognizes that water resources, they're all interconnected. We're all in this together.
It's a global challenge that requires global solutions. This report has certainly given us a lot to think about. But it's not just about understanding the problem, it's about taking action, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really important question, one that the report itself doesn't fully address.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. What's the question?
It focuses a lot on those large-scale solutions, big infrastructure projects, national policies, that kind of top-down approach.
Right.
But what about the role that individuals and local communities can play in all of this? How do we tackle this global water crisis from the ground up?
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Because it is easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this issue.
Right.
And feel like our individual actions, they're just a drop in the ocean.
I totally get that.
Yeah.
But even small changes in our daily lives, they can actually have this ripple effect.
Okay.
Things like being mindful of our water use at home, supporting sustainable agriculture, advocating for smarter water management policies in our communities, all of those things, they really do add up.
So it's about empowering individuals to be part of the solution, not just passive bystanders.
Exactly.
It's not just about these big global actors, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about all of us recognizing that we have a role to play.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really powerful message to end on. This report, it gives us a lot to ponder, but ultimately it's up to each and every one of us to take that knowledge and turn it into action.
Because knowledge without action, it's like a well without a bucket. It might hold potential, but it can't really quench our thirst for change. Right?
Well said. Couldn't agree more.
So there you have it. We've taken a deep dive into this really intricate world of global water infrastructure spending. We've talked about where the money goes, sometimes doesn't go, how it's being used, and why it matters to every single one of us.
We've explored the challenges, the potential solutions, and hopefully sparked some ideas about how we can all contribute to a more water-secure future. And, I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that every drop really does count.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.